All right, welcome to the Vijñapti podcast. I'm joined here today by my friend Nick Haight. Nick, it's good to have you back.
Good to be back and good to see everybody.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so last time we opened up with a little game, so I kind of wanted to lead off in the same way. So this is I put down here a free association game. So basically, I'm gonna throw out some words. There'll be names of different traditions of Buddhism, actually. And I'd like you to just say the first word that comes to mind when you think of this tradition.
Sounds
Uh,
good. I loved the last game, and so I'm excited for this one.
okay, awesome, cool, good to hear it. All right, in no particular order, let's start. Yogacara Buddhism,
Mind only,
Shingon Buddhism,
esoteric.
Soto Zen.
Ooh, Dogen,
Okay, Rinzai Zen,
Asai,
Madhyamika Buddhism.
middle way.
Okay, and yeah, that's all I have. So that concludes the game.
Sorry, I
Um,
threw in a couple of two-worders in there.
it's fine. Word, phrase, it all works the same. Um, cool. So yeah, thanks for that. So I wanted to kind of lead off with that because you are familiar with all of these, to one extent or another. And actually, in the chapter of Evan Thompson's book that we're going to be going over today, he mentions a few of these and maybe a few more or less directly than others. But he does make mention to Madhyamika Buddhism specifically, and I believe Yogacara implicitly through his mention of the Abhidharma. So let's dive right in. So we're talking about chapter 2 today again of Evan Thompson's book, Why I Am Not a Buddhist. And chapter 2 is why Buddhism is not true, I believe. Um, so essentially, um, well, let me turn it over to you. Just most generally speaking, what did you think of this chapter where he's kind of getting at this notion of Buddhism as being true in a philosophical sense? What did you make of it in the most general sense?
I thought this chapter was very fascinating, and I thought that it had a lot of really good and also really important points to make. I
Hmm.
am really enjoying all of this picking apart and tearing down of these modernist, new age influenced, self help influenced understandings of Buddhism. And I'm really enjoying also watching these other sort of schools of thought in other scholarly circles that are unfounded, also kind of getting collateral damage, like evolutionary psychology, for example.
Hmm.
It's really nice to see. I agree with the points that he makes. There are some points and some parts of his points that I would make differently if I were writing this paper, but
Sure.
we all get to the same point at the end. I would have liked to see a little bit more writing brought up about like why it's problematic to ask, is any religion true or not true? I think that it's kind of glossed over in the beginning part of this chapter, how he's like, he doesn't give enough air to the issue of like, no religion is true at all. And also, all religions are true for the people that practice them. And
Sure.
so, this issue of true and not true, it's a little bit thinly defined and it's a little bit subjective. And he's really looking towards somebody specific when he's writing this chapter. He's looking, of course, towards Robert Wright and Why Buddhism is True, that book he wrote. But overall, I still think that he very clearly and very thoroughly makes his point, which is that Robert Wright is completely wrong on a lot of this stuff, and that this issue of claiming that Buddhism is true because it's supported by science is very problematic.
Sure. Yeah. That's interesting. I thought he, from my perspective anyway, kind of does a decent job. I'm just looking at the first part right now, but he kind of compares it to Christianity, and he's like, well, if you saw that there was a bookstore for Christian Science or, Islamic in Science, like, how would you feel about that? It would feel, at least if you're a secular person, or at least just not someone who practices Christianity or Islam, you'd be a little suspect of that, is
Mhm.
essentially what he seems to be saying. Um, but I do kind of agree. Could you speak a bit more to that?
Absolutely, yeah. I think that using the word true in a scholarly context is really, really dangerous and really exposes you because the word true means a million things and it has a million different standards and metrics by which you can define it. And so you have to qualify this question, is Buddhism true, with first a sort of complex exploration into what you mean by true. Or, I mean, in this case, he's talking about Robert Wright's book, right? And he should be, because that book is problematic for a number of reasons that he brings up that I agree with. But if you don't give yourself a complex and thorough definition of the word true for your own argumentative purposes, then at least give Robert Wright's definition of true. He mentions, of course, that Robert Wright's argument is that Buddhism is true because these core essential ideas, what he's decided are core essential ideas in Buddhism, are supported by science. What he's decided is core essential stuff in science. It's two levels of essentialization that are problematic. And so
Right.
he understands and presents that claim, but what does it mean for something to be true because it is supported by science or because it is supported by a religion? I don't know if that actually comes through very clearly in the text. And
Okay.
I don't know if I actually have a correct answer for how to even start to discuss that. I'm not an expert on this issue really either, but I will say that I think that maybe true could have been changed out for supported or reinforced or maybe augmented. There's a bunch of different options, or maybe use a phrase instead
Gotcha.
of true.
Yeah. So essentially, to you, it doesn't come across as clear as you would have liked. Like how he basically, because as you mentioned, like he does go over kind of diving into Robert Wright's usage of the word true, and analyzing why that's problematic. But you're saying he didn't go far enough, essentially, or it just didn't uh like resonate that well. Um,
Sort of, yeah. I think that I would have liked to see a little bit of discussion of why this is sort of a problematic question for anybody, Robert Wright included, to be asking.
mhm,
Um, just a little bit more, not just from this scenario of a Christian Science library or something, but
sure.
maybe from the scenario of understanding that truth is subjective and truth is also difficult in itself to define. And it's heavily influenced by issues of belief and conceptions and essentializations of those conceptions. And so it's just something I would have liked to see, maybe like another page about in the beginning,
Gotcha.
before he got into Robert Wright stuff.
Gotcha. Yeah, yeah. You know, maybe kind of what I'm hearing from that is like um presenting what solution he would have liked to have seen to this question of truth in order to kind of guide the discussion, instead of like, you know, kind of like what is truth? What is, picking it apart in the ways that you're describing, but not kind of like leading anywhere with that, at least immediately. Um, I do kind of sense that as well in terms of the organization. But thank you. I appreciate that perspective. So I'm just looking over notes that I have here. Um, so the next part of the chapter that he goes over is kind of picking apart this idea of the modular model of the mind that Robert Wright proposes. Um, which he derives, or at least Thompson says he derives from the perspective of evolutionary psychology. And basically, to make a long story short, Thompson proposes that, this idea of evolutionary psychology as a model of the mind to compare Buddhism against, it's interesting, but there's a lot of problems with evolutionary psychology in and of itself. And he says that this isn't actually the best way to look at the mind. He points to what he refers to as embodied uh, cognitive, sorry, I can't find embodied cognitive science. And that's, I guess, a model of the mind that he developed with Francisco Varela, I believe. So yeah, I was curious to know kind of what you think of this, moving away from evolutionary psychology to what he proposes of embodied cognitive science. What did you make of that?
I was all on board for that whole thing. I have always had a problem with evolutionary psychology, going
Sure,
back even before my Buddhism studies career. I
sure.
have I have seen countless misunderstandings of Darwin's theory of evolution and also misapplications of it. And I've seen misunderstandings and misapplications even among scholarly circles. Of course, you see plenty of those kinds of things in like the common everyday vernacular with everyday people who aren't experts, right? My own family, when I was a biology major, they asked me, okay, you're a biology major. Can you genuinely explain to us if evolution is true, why are there still monkeys? And at first I was like upset. Like this is a grave misunderstanding of evolution and how it works. But then I was like, wait, they're actually
Sure.
being genuine. They don't know. And a lot of people don't know. And these misunderstandings get more traction than the real thing, to the point where these fields like evolutionary psychology, they run, and they have a whole entire scholarly lineage of people who are defending it and who are writing in its sort of framework and who are actually doing studies on people within its framework. And I'm all on board with Thompson here to say none of this stuff is founded on any of the evidence we have, and its assumptions are inherently faulty. So Evan Thompson does a great job of specifically picking apart every bit of that. I don't need to go over it again. I would like to speak to this question of embodied cognitive science.
Sure.
I think that this is a very interesting, very interesting presentation, a very interesting model for understanding consciousness or the mind or something like that. And what I like about it, just on a surface level, for one, is that it does not purport to be a comprehensive theory of mind. It does not purport to be a comprehensive theory of consciousness or self. It purports to understand how we can look at psychology outside of or in opposition to the context of evolutionary psychology. It's the direct response to this massive modularity theory of how the brain works and how people work. And I think that it is a very appropriate response, and I think it's a very founded response, and I think that it's a very widely applicable response. I think that it takes a lot of the wind out of the sails of so much of the problematic stuff that comes out of evolutionary psychology. One thing that is pretty common in you might say popular evolutionary psychology is to say this thing he mentions, the Stone Age brain in the modern skull, the idea that we have caveman oriented brains, we have lizard brains that have these specific desires and needs and these specific problems that it's designed to solve, but that we live in a modern world where those problems are either minimized or completely done away with. And a lot of people will claim this is sort of the foundation for a lot of mental illnesses. Anxiety is a direct result, they will say, of this lack of being chased by tigers all the time, but the brain is still feeling like it's chased by tigers because that's what it's used to from the Pleistocene era. And they'll say depression is, you know, and this is one of the crazier claims I've heard from evolutionary psychology foundations, is like depression is caused because we don't hunt and gather in our day-to-day lives and don't get the serotonin, the dopamine, the endorphins that come from doing something like that for survival. We don't get the endorphins from perpetuating our own survival because there's been so many stages of separation installed by modernity between ourselves and what we eat and how we get food. Before it was like,
Sure.
I'm going to trudge off into the forest and I'm going to get food, and then you go out there and you get food. But now there's money and there's jobs that you have to work at to get money, and you have to exchange that money for food. And then you have to go and, you know, before you exchange that money, you have to go somewhere where the food is, and you're not hunting it, you're not killing it, you're just
Right.
handing over paper and getting it back. And so they'll say that because of modernity, we have taken all of the we've taken all of the bite out of life, and that causes depression. This is all just complete and utter nonsense. This is not a good way, in my opinion, to understand how mental illness comes about. I think that understanding the mind and understanding the person in terms of interactions between the organism and the environment, as he proposes, and I think that understanding the person in terms of the mutual feedback and the mutual exchange that goes on between person and environment, and understanding also the person in terms of interaction between person and persons, like person and culture, for example. I think that's all a much more comprehensive and a much more, I would say, well-founded way to sort of diagnose what existing as a human being actually is. What do you think about it? You're in a master's program in counseling, in psychology. You learn these things and deal with these things day by day. So, what do you think about evolutionary psychology, and what do you think about embodied cognitive science?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. So the first thing that comes to mind for me is I completely agree with your assessment of the ECS, embodied cognitive science model, offering, kind of what I would give name to as systems level understanding of consciousness, right? You mentioned at least I feel like you were alluding to that the evolutionary psychological model, while it appears to, contextualize people within their environments to the extent that, we say yes, like our social environment is very different now than it was before. And, I agree with that, but um, it, it almost in a way, how would I describe that? It kind of bites itself in the butt a little bit in the sense that um, it says like, yes, we have these biological tendencies, we have these biological proclivities towards um, different modes of consciousness, um, and that's true. But what I kind of how I interpret that as being the main problem is that it centers all of the problems on the individual,
Mhm.
especially with respect to mental illness. And that's, it's interesting that you say that because I'm doing some work right now on a paper and some YouTube videos for a series on alternatives to the medical model of mental health, right? And basically, what the medical model of mental health says is that you have this thing in your brain where it doesn't work right and it's not really functioning right, and that's called a mental illness or a mental disorder. So basically, we're going to give you either medicine or we're going to teach you how to think differently. So then, you won't feel as bad and you won't feel depressed. You won't feel anxious. And there's a place for that. And it certainly has some level of truth to it in application, right? I'm not saying or suggesting at all that there's no biological influence on mental health. But what that kind of a model does is, again, it centers all of the attention on the individual and kind of disregards their entire social context, right? Um, if we see that people are, uh, you know, that the minimum wage has remained stagnant for decades and that rent continues to increase dramatically, and that the price of food is shooting up and people are having immense trouble looking for jobs, like these things seem irrelevant, but I would argue it's because we have been indoctrinated at a certain level to accept this highly medicalized, highly individualized model of mental health. And what we should be doing is exactly what you're saying, which is let's contextualize people as organisms within their environment. For human beings, that's inherently social environment. And the last thing that I'll say that I really like is I can't pull it up right here. I don't want to waste too much time just looking, but there's a point at which Thompson basically makes the argument that the evolutionary psychological model of the mind basically um, it posits that organisms are simply the passive recipients of environmental factors, as
Hmm.
opposed to the reality that actually organisms shape the environment. It's a dynamic process, and I forget exactly how you said it, but it is truly this dynamic interplay between organism and environment, and organism and other organism, and it's very dynamic as opposed to this more or less static, passive model of evolutionary psychology. Um, so yeah, those are kind of some thoughts that came to my mind. Um, hopefully that maybe I was just rambling a lot, but hopefully there was something to kind of pick out of that.
No, that made a lot of sense. While you were talking about the alternative to medical models of mental illness, I'm immediately just remembering about you that you're really into Carl Jung, and he is very strong into this idea that um, there's a spectrum upon which that we can understand the development of mental illness in people, and even describing a thing as mental illness is an inherently sort of judgmental and a little bit of a problematic thing to say, because it doesn't address what you're talking about, which is these social causes, these environmental causes, these cultural causes, these non-individual causes for things that go wrong in our lives, right? And it's very fascinating. I'm all on board for that, and I hope to watch those and read about that if it ever breaks out of your grad school program. These YouTube videos and these papers that you're writing. Um, Additionally, going towards this understanding of organisms as passive in their environment, I'm all there too. I remember in school in biology, in at a university level, they still teach people the Hardy-Weinberg equation, which is an equation whose purpose is to assign a numerical value to selective pressures in an environment and to sort of understand how organisms reach equilibriums with these pressures, with these this environment that they're in, according to them being passive in it. So a selective pressure would be food availability, and the number of organisms would go up or down based on this food availability, whether it's something that they can eat, whether it's something there's enough for all of them to eat, whether it's, going to come back every season, et cetera, et cetera. And it takes a lot of the agency out of the organism. Humans construct their environment more so than any other organism on Earth. And so, in order to understand sort of our context, we have to recognize that most of our environment is constructed, and that's for better or worse. It's contrived. And so, it doesn't have the weight or the significance of like a natural force. What I mean by that is a society that's based on currency for its economy, that's all made up. The value of currency is made up. It's not it's not life or death like a hurricane is, right? But then that's also kind of the bad side. It's sort of all made up, and it's easy to get caught up in the value judgments and the sort of internalizing the systems at work so that you think of yourself differently in the context of this system. And so I think that embodied cognitive science gives you a as a model, it gives you a very strong path for sort of reaching an equilibrium between like taking things, the system around you, the environment you live in, too seriously and being as like natural forces, or on the other side, keeping you from getting sort of, you know, trapped in the whirlwind of it all, if any of that makes sense. And that's where he brings in Buddhist mindfulness meditation in the modern context as a means of sort of mediating and understanding that relationship. And I'm sure that you're excited to talk about that part of his embodied cognitive science model.
Yeah, that's actually the chapter I have the most disagreements with.
Really?
And yeah, and as I'm rereading it, I am starting to like um kind of agree with more of what he's saying there, but from a more clinical standpoint, I have, a few disagreements with him there. But yeah, no, I appreciate that perspective. The thing that I took from that the most was this idea of culture and that kind of being our environment. And I think that's a good segue, kind of before we get it more into the nitty gritty Buddhist stuff that I want to get your take on is so this is what I had written down initially. I'll just go ahead and read that. So this is kind of more to the science versus religion. How do we think about this relationship stuff that we were talking about earlier? So Wright claims that Buddhism is true on the basis of being empirically substantiated through the most significant theories of, in this case, contemporary evolutionary psychology. Thompson dismantles this argument by pointing out that the reality is that Buddhism is very much oriented towards ethics as opposed to empirical truth. Um, and exper and science by means of experiment, and that such matters that Buddhism is interested in are really matters of philosophy that are gauged and evaluated through appeals to normative philosophical judgments, which themselves are mediated by culture, as opposed to being deduced through, the scientific process. That was very jargony. I'm sure you got it, but I'll just, for my own sake and for the viewers, kind of break it down a little bit. So basically, what I was getting at there was that Thompson points out that Robert Wright is saying basically Buddhism is true, right? Because it's empirically validated by science. And what Wright is saying is, first of all, that doesn't really mean anything. And second of all, um, that's not what Buddhism is interested in. Buddhism is primarily interested in ethics and cosmology and things that science simply is neither interested in nor equipped to really deal with. So and the way that Buddhism says like this is good, this is bad in an ethical sense is based on its own normative, cultural, philosophical judgments, which might be right, but are nonetheless culture bound to the history and the history and culture of the Buddhist legacy. So hopefully that kind of there's something to make of that, but I'm curious what you kind of think of that assessment.
I absolutely agree. And I think that you broke it down really well that the center of the problem, he's kind of building up right in this bit. He's building up to start talking about his issue with Buddhist modernism as a whole, and evolutionary psychology and Robert Wright is a small part of that. His issue is derived in the most general sense, in one sentence, from picking out these translated claims, translated from their original language into English, people picking out these claims and seeing that they are similar or that they are on a very face value surface level the same as claims they see elsewhere and thinking that that implies a relationship between the two where there is no relationship. There is no relationship of truth. There's no relationship of influence, of history, of anything. There's no mutual reinforcement going on between two claims, which, the sequence of words on the page just happen to be the same or similar. And the reason why that doesn't work out right is you can't pull claims out like that. You can't pull bits out of their context. You can't pull bits out of their framework, their system, because both Western modern science and Buddhism are internally coherent for the most part systems of claims, systems of evidence, systems of experimental evidence in science, or systems of these normative, ethical, moral judgments in Buddhism. These are both independently mediated by culture, like you say. They're mediated by culture and history and by the agendas and the values of the collective people within those sort of schools of thought. And any sort of relationship is coincidental or it is founded on something that is not related to truth, that's not related to maybe science being right or religion being right or both of them being right on something. In biology, they have this concept of coevolution where two very distantly separated organisms end up sort of expressing genes for a specific body part that looks the same, right? And evolutionary psychology loves coevolution because they think that it sort of implies that natural selection and organisms that are subject to natural selection are in a problem solution relationship. So organisms in the ocean, they need to swim away from predators, so they all evolve fins, right? This is, like we said, problematic. I think that it's equally problematic whenever coevolution happens intellectually. Whenever science tells us all things are transient, anything that you observe is just a snapshot of a constantly changing system. And when Buddhism says all things are transient and permanent, and we decide that coevolution implies there's a problem or there's a something out there that we're both responding to in the same way, therefore this is something, I don't think it matches. I don't think it works. I don't think you can make that claim. And so
Sure.
I'm all there with Thompson on dismantling this idea of the sort of problem solution relationship, dismantling this whole concept of pulling out individual translated bits of Buddhism and deciding they represent core essential values, core essential judgments, core essential claims in Buddhism, and then comparing and contrasting with anything else, everything else that you see around you. It doesn't jive. It doesn't jive. And he's right to sort of push back against it in this bit of his book.
Yeah. Thank you. That's very interesting. So you had gone over my paper on consilience, and thank you for that. I actually am considering adding some more. It's currently a four-dimensional model. I'm actually thinking of making it 6 dimensions, and that sounds kind of arbitrary, but basically what I want to do with that in the most general terms is essentially create something where we could derive some type of process for establishing experimentation based on intuition that people gain through insight into meditation, into other kinds of mystical experience. But to have some way that we do that, and at least kind of like what I'm getting from you with that is that if we want to do that, we have to start if we want to even have any chance to do it, and maybe you won't agree. But if we want to have even the chance to approach that, we need to begin with, yes, Buddhism is interested in completely different things from the outset than science is. Buddhism is interested in soteriology. Buddhism is interested in how do you live a good life. Buddhism is interested in how do you be a good Buddhist. Science is interested in establishing ontological truths of nature based on very specific processes of rational deduction through experimentation. And so um, I believe that it is possible to establish some sort of process where we can um, you know, find something interesting on the one hand, but also find something that has teeth to it in an epistemological sense. But we have to begin from the point that you're talking about of these two things, though they do um, perhaps have many parallels, like began from two very different places. And if we want to be intellectually critical, um, we need to be very cognizant of that going forward in this kind of conciliant endeavor. What are your initial thoughts of that?
I totally agree. I think that my issue with the science versus religion debate, as I've seen it play out, or in your consilience essay, you even go further to make it science versus the humanities, which I think is a very good idea, a very complete and thorough way to present the issue at hand. One of my issues, of course, has been, like you say, they're setting out to accomplish different goals. But another issue that I have had with it is this issue of a well-rounded person will find something useful in both. A well-rounded person who is not obsessive and tribal will find something that makes their life better through both methods, in both systems of argument, in both goals, in both ideas of how the world is or should be, respectively. It's not so factionalist as I'm all science and no humanities. You know,
Sure.
basically they are different approaches in my view of understanding the world we live in and the people that we are, and their methods are not incongruent because they're just different. Like an apple is not incongruent with an orange. They're just both fruits. And
Yeah.
and you can eat both of them and you can
Right.
enjoy both of them. And that doesn't make you like a science traitor, somebody who's a scientist who, oh no, read a book by Immanuel Kant or something. There's nothing like that. There's
Yeah.
nothing so important and so serious about ascribing to one or the other.
Okay.
And so, and that's kind of, it's kind of like a backwards way of getting at consilience, because
Sure.
it's like, of course we can come to a comprehensive consilient understanding because it doesn't matter. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
it's a different approach. I still respect your approach a lot. I still appreciate your approach a lot because my approach doesn't really build any bridges. It just sort of ignores the need for them. I think that building bridges between the two and understanding these things and being critical from the outset is helpful because of the reasons that you've described. And I think that consilience is possible through understanding those differences, and necessary even through understanding those differences rather than um, regarding those differences as incompatibility.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that. And I appreciate that critique because, the as I'm thinking about what you're saying, it's like maybe I did have kind of this like caricaturish like scientist on the one side of the battlefield and like the humanities poetry people on the other side. And yeah, I'll have to think about that more. But I do very much appreciate that. And I agree. Um, I despite I guess how I kind of wrote about it, I do think that these bridges at least to me, are maybe not that radical as we think they are. But I'll have to revisit that. So I do appreciate that. Um, okay, so I wanted to move on now to kind of again some of the more nitty-gritty Buddhist stuff. Um, so Thompson talks about um his initial kind of how he approached embodied cognitive science with Varela when he first established it, as kind of going through this Madhyamika um, kind of lens, and focusing a lot on emptiness. Um, I guess the first thing, well, I guess I'll ask you, what do you really like about embodied cognitive science? And what do you see as being most amenable to a Buddhist perspective? For me, it would be kind of this phenomenological orientation towards experience. At least that's what I see in it. What do you see in it that you like?
I also really like the emphasis on day-to-day experience. Experience, I think, is one of the dimensions of the mind or of understanding consciousness that you add to the 3D understanding, right? Am I remembering that correctly from your paper that experience, like immediate subjective
Yeah,
experience is important?
yeah,
I agree that that's sort of huge in this framework. And I think that experience is one of the ways that this model, embodied cognitive science, can bridge the gap that he presents that exists in this sort of, he calls it the fundamental generative enigma at the heart of Buddhism. This issue that Robert Sharf puts as, quote, liberation is impossible, yet it is achieved, unquote. It's this idea that there's nothing in Buddhism. It's this sort of idea that you can't get to an unconditioned state or this state that's free from conditions, that's the state that's free from causes, the state that is free from all the constraints of samsara from a samsaric position. And there's lots of different ways that Buddhism resolves that issue. But what I like about how he resolves that issue is you just do it through meditation. You do it through shaping your own experience. You do it through shaping your own sort of orientation to existence, not necessarily in a religious way, but maybe a religious way if that's what works for you.
mhm,
And you sort of you don't worry about these sort of, you might say, linguistic contradictions that exist. You just try to enhance your day-to-day experience. That's sort of kind of how you achieve holistic well-being. And it's a small, little by little, incremental thing that I think that it really works. It's a really strong part of his model.
yeah, yeah. I also like that part, and I like that he really kind of, as you're saying, he doesn't just take the superficial, like, what did this one like Buddhist guy that I heard say is Buddhism, or what does Alan Watts say, is enlightenment or whatever, as much as I love Alan Watts. Um, and and there's nothing wrong with that, like you're saying. He's great, but um he really goes a step further to say, okay, well, what is the rhetoric that we're attaching to this, it inevitably, right? And he talks about enlightenment more later on in its own chapter. I think it's chapter 6, the rhetoric of enlightenment.
Mhm.
um but yeah, no, um I appreciate that. I have so many things written down here. I realized I don't really have any good ways of turning those into questions. So, I think I'd like to kind of just open it up to you. I'm sure you have, stuff that you wrote down in terms of his assessment of Buddhism, and kind of the rest of the chapter, it looks like, is, um, exploring these Buddhist concepts and their relationship to his own version of embodied cognitive science. Um, is there anything that you wanted to talk about specifically? Anything that you liked? Anything that you thought was problematic? More on the Buddhist end of things.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, I'd be glad to speak to some of those things. First
Sure.
off, I think that in passing, secular Buddhism catches collateral damage, and I'm kind of into that. He says that somebody else claims that secular Buddhism is a religion and is not secular, as the title would suggest. And he says, and I agree with that. And then he moves on and doesn't mention them again.
Okay.
I fully agree that secular Buddhism is religious. Is it a religion? Hard to say,
Yeah.
but it is religious. I have a whole episode on my podcast, Bright on Buddhism, that discusses this issue of secularity and sort of the contradiction, and the incompatibility, the paradox that it implies. I, in my opinion, I don't think that secularity is possible. I don't think that it exists in the real world. I don't think that it is a realistic goal or a realistic sort of foundation for understanding any religion, let alone Christianity or Buddhism or Islam, any of the major religions that most people in the world follow. We would think that it was ridiculous if somebody said, I am a secular Christian. I go to church every week and I pray, but I don't believe in God. Or I'm a secular Christian. I believe in the golden rule, but I've never read the Bible and I don't know what it says. You know, all of that stuff, we would say that's completely foolish. And secular
Sure.
Buddhism does similar stuff. And secular Buddhists claim similar things. They say, I believe in the philosophy of Buddhism, but I haven't read the sutras and I don't know what they say. Or they say, I think that the sutras are a product of their time and that we need to pick and choose things that are applicable to our time. And usually the things they pick and choose are going to be basically like non-religious stuff that fits into a narrative about what Buddhism is, that is inherently problematic and erases traditions of ritual, erases traditions of cosmology, of literature and art, and basically boils it down to a very boring utilitarian philosophy, if that makes sense. A very boring sort of vague prescription that says just do good things and doesn't really say what those good things are or why you should do them. Because if you answer the question of why, the answer in Buddhism is karma, but they're not gonna like that. So they say just because it's a good thing. And then suddenly they've spun out into non-Buddhist stuff. It's a whole mess. I'm glad that he sort of at least just gave that 4 words, because that's a whole big, huge issue that I have a lot of, you might say, scholarly issues with. For clarification, if someone identifies as secular Buddhist and that works for them, that's fine. I have no issue. I mean, do you and be happy. But you have to understand sort of the history, and you have to understand sort of the the process of essentialization and erasure that's going on in order for you to be able to do that. And it's not like it's hurting anybody right now if you're being nice and you're doing secular Buddhism at the same time.
Hmm.
But you just buyer beware is what I always say. Um, Moving on to some more of the Buddhist stuff he talks about, he mentions the issue of naturalistic Buddhists and how they understand these core Buddhist tenets that we unpack in this book out of Madhyamaka and out of implicitly Yogacara
Yes.
and all these early schools. And I'm really, really in favor. I love his diagnosis of the problem at the heart of naturalistic Buddhism and the problematic claims that naturalistic Buddhists make, and the things that they ignore that are central to the Buddhist scheme, you might say. I love his bit about how the paradox of nirvana that we've mentioned a little bit ago, it doesn't exist at the core of naturalistic Buddhism. And so they sort of miss the bus. They sort of miss the entire Um, the entire he calls it existential transformation that comes from sitting with that paradox, from
Yeah.
sitting with that paradox of nirvana.
Yeah.
I think that his diagnoses of how different schools of Buddhism solve that paradox are all very accurate, very much supported by the texts. He's definitely done his homework on these parts. Um, I'm frankly amazed that he's able to boil down these centuries of debates and centuries of sort of sectarian divides and disagreements and agreements into what's essentially like, I think, 3 or 4 pages
Right.
of
Yeah.
this chapter. There's a lot going on in those 3 or 4 pages. Like 78 through, I don't know, like 85 are just huge,
Yeah.
huge. And it's very concisely presented, and I appreciate that a lot.
Yeah.
Um, what did you think about those those parts, especially the maybe sectarian isn't the right word, but maybe those parts that deal with lineages, specific lineages like Madhyamaka and Yogacara, Zen, etc.
Yeah. So, you know, for the viewers, I have my bachelor's in religion with an emphasis on Mahayana Buddhism. It's been 4 years since I graduated though. And I've been studying other things since then. So, I do have that background, but I am also kind of far removed at this point from a lot of these discussions and questions. So from, to reread it just kind of brought back to me the wonder of Buddhism. And it really for me gets at what you were saying before of that this naturalistic Buddhist conception of things just it loses so much of the interesting and fascinating dialogue on these very important issues that Buddhism is absolutely concerned with. Um, you know, Thompson, again, even though it's only 5, 6 pages, gives this hugely profound um, summary of all of these existential questions. Well, how can I become enlightened if enlightenment is essentially impossible? Even within traditions, there's so much debate between about this question, and what naturalistic Buddhism kind of does is kind of like, I don't know, Four Noble Truths and Eightfold Path, like that's all. And if that's all you need, that's fine. But I I can't help but think, and I'm not saying everyone has to think exactly as Evan Thompson does, but you know, you don't have to be a Buddhist necessarily. You can be a friend to Buddhism and really love Buddhism without having to limit yourself to, one, what traditional Buddhism says, but two, what this naturalistic version of Buddhism kind of limits you to in its scope. Um, so yeah, I since you brought that up, I was kind of curious, just for your own perspective, which of these descriptions of nirvana do you vibe with the most? Is it the Madhyamika? Is it this Zen Buddhist kind of just sitting in the paradox? Um, what yeah, what do you feel like you lean more towards?
That's a good question. Yeah, it's so I have an answer to this, but I want to give a brief sort of, as brief as I can be, um, a
Go
brief
ahead.
sort of preface to it that um, is important to the topic of Evan Thompson studying Buddhism but not being Buddhist, and Robert Wright not studying Buddhism but being Buddhist. um,
Sure.
this is sort
Yep.
of this is sort of vital. So, I have been studying Buddhism pretty much nonstop since I was a sophomore in college. That would have been 2016. So you know, that's 8 years ago now, almost nine.
Yeah.
And I have been studying it in a scholarly fashion, truly a scholarly fashion, a lot of reading and a lot of writing and thinking, but not a lot of doing. Lately, since I've moved to Seattle, I've started going to a temple and I have started doing Buddhism in a way that I had not done before. Does that mean that I'm now a monastic and I only own a bowl and a robe? No, it does not mean that. Does that mean that I am perfectly following the 10 precepts, Four Noble Truths, Eightfold Path every day, all day? It certainly does not mean that either. What it means is that I am doing something that other Buddhists all around the world do on a daily basis. I'm going to the temple and I'm doing the stuff at the temple that the temple does. And that happens at, sort of temple time. And then I just kind of haven't touched the rest of my life in a significant way related to Buddhism. This is presenting me with an interesting problem, a number of interesting problems. One is like this question of, okay, I've steeped myself in this sort of academic, this very thorough, very text-based understanding of Buddhism for so long that I go in here to the temple and everything is familiar. I can talk for hours about the mandalas on the left and right of the image of Vairocana. I can talk for hours about Kukai and the stuff that he has written and said. I can talk for hours about that stuff and say lots of interesting things about them. But not only will no one else there know what I mean or what I'm talking about, for the most part, I don't want to say that they're not intelligent. I don't want to say that they're not, you know, mindful of what they're participating in, but they're certainly not all Buddhism scholars like me. Not only do they not will they not know what I'm talking about, but at the same time, they'll be doing it better than I do it in my own daily life. So that's an interesting problem. Another interesting problem is I have gone swimming for 8 years and I have to truly ask myself, am I wet or not? I have been swimming for 8 years nonstop. And I have to ask myself, am I wet or not? This seems like a nonsensical question, a stupid question. The answer you would say, of course, is of course you're wet. You've been swimming for 8 years. You can't swim for 8 years and not get wet. But I have to ask myself, what have I, how have I influenced the rest of my life outside of my scholarly Buddhism work and my recent doing Buddhism sometimes situation? How's that influenced the rest of my life? How am I changed for having done all of this? I have read tons of sutras. I've read tons of Abhidharma texts. I've read tons of academic works written in English and Japanese about those texts. And I have very thorough understandings of what a lot of them are trying to say and how a lot of people sort of operationalize them and actionalize them in history and in the present day. What about me? Am I doing that unconsciously? Am I doing that consciously? Am I a Buddhist? I understand that Evan Thompson is not, but am I a Buddhist? I actually don't have a good answer. I mean, when the census taker comes, of course, I'm going to self-identify as one because that's the closest answer to true. But I don't know how close. Is it 100%? Is it 51%? I think that the answer could change depending on the day. And then there's the issue of religious identity in the modern Western context as mediated by Judeo-Christian religions. Do I identify with Buddhism because I believe it, because I have faith in it? Well, that's a very Christian way of thinking of things. Maybe a lot of people who go to the temple don't believe it. They don't have faith in it. They go for different reasons. And so it's all very confusing. I don't know the answer, and I don't know if I ever will know the answer for myself. And so this is all relevant to this question of which conception of nirvana or which solution to the nirvana problem, you might say, vibes the most with me. I can see the foundations of the arguments that are made by all these different phases and ones that he doesn't even mention of Buddhist thought, right? I can see sort of the Madhyamaka and leading into Mahayana claim made by Nagarjuna, where he says, quote, there is no distinction between samsara and nirvana. There's no distinction whatever between nirvana and samsara.
I love
What
that
is the
quote.
limit of nirvana? What's the limit of samsara? There's not even the finest gap to be found. That makes sense. I can sit with the Buddha nature argument. There is a little bit of the unconditioned in the conditioned, meaning that there is this inherent enlightenment nature to all things. I can sit with a paradox like Zen people do. But knowing all of that and feeling all of that, the one that I do, not the one that I read, write, think about, but the one that I do when I go to the temple is the esoteric one, the Shingon one, the Kukai one. And that one is much closer to this Buddha nature one, this idea that there is the unconditioned in the conditioned. Esoteric Buddhism takes it a step further, and they say that there is no such distinction, similar to Nagarjuna, kind of. Nagarjuna actually is in the sort of main lineage of teachers and students in esoteric Buddhism. The lineage, interestingly, it doesn't start with Siddhartha Gautama, the historical Buddha. It starts with Vairocana, the cosmic Buddha, and then he transmits the Dharma to his disciple Vajrasattva, and then he transmits his to Nagarjuna. So Nagarjuna is third in line. He is understood in esoteric Buddhism to have got it. And the idea is that there's no distinction like conditioned, unconditioned. We are all in a world that materializes, manifests according to this ah syllable, the first letter of the Sanskrit alphabet, ah. And this vibration is Vairocana. This is his sort of, you might say, his heartbeat, his pulse throughout the entire universe. And because of that, we sort of exist as manifestations of the body of Vairocana. But we're not his physical body because, there's rocks and there's trees and there's people and there's animals. These can't all be body parts of a physical body. Actually, we're all part of his Dharma body, his sort of corpus of teachings. His teachings are said to be universal and all inclusive in the sense that there's not anything that can't be accounted for by them. That is a contestable claim, I would say. But the idea is that we're all letters of this world text, if that makes sense. And this text is being preached by Vairocana to Vairocana for his own enjoyment, for his own delight. Mm-hmm. And there's so many fun ways that you can interpret that. It's like he's reduced Kukai, who writes primarily about this stuff after reading esoteric sutras and tantric texts and sastras and stuff. He has reduced all of human suffering and euphoria, all of human anger and sadness and helplessness and grief and agony and joy, happiness, love, etc., to basically just, I don't know, something as pointless as it's just happening for fun. And so that's wonderful. I think that airs towards the side of the, you might say, the cultural thing I was talking about earlier, where you understand that money is made up and that the value of money is made up, and not to get too hung up in the made upness of it all. I think that that's a wonderful way to look at it. And another way to look at it too is that we are all Buddhas, fully realized in real life. And you could say that we are embodying our maybe non-Buddha-like characteristics as a teaching tool, or you could say that Buddhahood has been sort of expanded to be defined as the totality of all existence, all the time, everywhere. And I think that either answer is really good. I think that either answer really vibes with me the most. And so then nirvana is here and now, but in a different way than you might say that the early Mahayana Buddha nature people think that it is. And it's esoteric because this sort of idea is hard to figure out. It's hard to wrap your head around. It requires a lot of faith, for one thing, something that Evan Thompson mentions about um, about early Buddhism dealing with this issue. And it also has to do with a lot of sort of moving past your conceptions that are founded in language specifically. I think that a lot of the problems that come up in Buddhist soteriology that then need to be solved with endless lineages of, these treatises that go on for thousands of pages and, get very boring and difficult to read. um, I think that they're created by a language issue. And if you just do away with the language issue, then there is no issue actually at the heart of it all. Um, so yeah, that's a long and complicated answer to probably just say that um, I believe the Shingon Buddhist claim the most out of all of these different claims that I have seen. And the only way that I know that I believe it the most is because that's the one that I do. That's the one that I like doing, every weekend in Seattle. And I can't tell you why I like that one the most. It's just the one that I do.
Yeah. I love that because it is a direct appeal to experience. It's the one you believe because that's the one that's been tried and true for you, and you like it, you love it. And I think that's actually a pretty good reason to posit something as, not the, truth of the universe, but as being true. Um
Hmm.
and Um, so it's kind of two more questions and then we can kind of wrap this up. But um as we've been talking about this, there's kind of been this voice in my head um saying like, okay, well, someone could easily say, well, so what? Right? I think we mentioned a few times kind of like um this naturalistic view of Buddhism kind of strips the tradition from its very interesting and ethical, foundations of culture and history. But someone could easily say, well, okay, but I don't care about any of that. I have science. Um, and so I have a quote from Thompson that I think is very timely to bring in as we kind of um, I guess, get a little bit more general again. So he's talking about Madhyamika Buddhism and emptiness, and he says this. He says the view of emptiness is far more radical than Evan or than Robert Wright's kind of assessment of things. Emptiness doesn't just pertain to what we perceive; it pertains to all phenomena. Um, And so he says, it doesn't make sense to think that science reveals how reality uh, is in itself apart from us. Rather, science reveals how reality is in relation to our conceptual systems and methods of investigation. And I thought that was just a really great summary of kind of what's at stake here. Because, I know maybe I just sound like a parrot at this point, but science doesn't have all the answers and it can't have all of the answers. Neither does Buddhism. But to the extent that we can find something interesting um, that, is in some way um, testable or to create something that's somewhat testable. Um, I think that is kind of how we should be thinking of things, not as like, well, so what, this is just trivial, but seeing that like, no, there are huge plot holes within the mainstream scientific conception of things. It's a good narrative and there's a lot of evidence to support it, but it doesn't have a totally comprehensive view of everything with all the answers. And so, yeah, kind of my point there is that, um, maybe I'm just saying this to assuage myself, but, it's not just that, oh, this is like an interesting thing to think about. Um, I truly believe that this discussion and other discussions of religion are really truly important if we want to understand the nature of our minds. Because while science is an incredible and powerful tool to do that, it is simply insufficient by itself because of the reasons that Robert Wright points out, that it reveals how reality is, but only in relation to its own conceptual systems and methods of investigation. So, um, kind of closing on that note, I kind of wanted to know if you had any final thoughts there.
Yeah, I agree with that quote a lot. I appreciated that quote too because it sort of it's another one of these things he does that takes wind out of the sails of the science versus religion debate conflict that's been going on in you know modern academic discourse for so long. And it's also speaking to the fact that that I guess the easiest way for me to boil it down is to kind of use that same metaphor that they use or claim that they use in Shingon, which is these are stories that we tell ourselves because we get something out of them, and these narratives may have plot holes or they may have these spaces that don't quite add up. They might have discrepancies. And because they have discrepancies doesn't mean that they're any less valid. And because um, these discrepancies or these absences, these gaps exist, is actually that's kind of the reason why these narratives are ongoing. I think that another issue I have with the science versus religion debate is that it is founded on questions that have been answered, and it is turning its orientation away from questions that remain yet unanswered, either by science or humanities, science or religion. And those questions are much more interesting to me. Those questions are much more urgent and much more, I don't know, they're much more relevant to our daily lives in ways that the answered questions may not be in terms of these debates about which one is right, which one's wrong, which one is founded, which one's unfounded. So because of that, I think, yeah, my response to that section is that it is correct. He's right. I'm really agreeing with him, and it speaks to the stories that humanity tells itself using conventions either from the humanities or conventions from science or from both, all in the interest of shaping our reality in a way that makes our experience better somehow. And I think that that makes them equally appreciable and equally valuable and valid.
Awesome. Thank you. I I love exploring this book because I mean I think it just comes at such a good time. Yes, there is this ongoing religion versus science debate, and as you point out, maybe it's, less than warranted in many ways. But if there is one idea of like this consilience between science and religion, it usually occurs within the context of Buddhist exceptionalism. And I didn't realize that until I had read this book, and I didn't realize that I was very guilty of it until I had read this book. Um, in maybe after we finish this book, I have the capstone project that I worked on with Mayer, which I told him, quote, was the greatest thing I have ever written in my entire life. As I, submitted it. I don't know if you read it, but anyway, I commit quite a few errors of Buddhist modernism in there, but um, you know, I think it could be a fun read, and I appreciate having your perspective, um, because I'm not, I'm no longer swimming in these Buddhist concepts myself. Um, and it's great to kind of explore this together with an expert like you. So thank you. Do you have anything that you'd like to close with?
Just saying thank you as well for having me on, and thank you to everybody who listens. And thank you to Evan Thompson for giving us so much to work with and to discuss here. I think that this has been very interesting and very enlightening. I say that at the end of every episode because I think it's funny. And I've appreciated coming on the show, and I appreciate you having me on and asking me all these questions and discussing these concepts with me at a level that um, even though you say you're not an expert in Buddhism, you have taken the precepts, you have studied these things for a long time, and you're definitely also an expert in the psychology, the mental health, the sort of the other side of this part of Evan Thompson's book. And so I appreciate your expertise on that. And I'm looking forward to continuing on through the rest of the book.
Right. Thanks for that, Nick. Appreciate you as always. If you'd like to hear more from Nick, you can watch or listen to his podcast, Bright on Buddhism. I believe it's on all platforms now, if I'm not
That's right.
mistaken. Okay, awesome. So people could just look up Bright on Buddhism on YouTube or Spotify or something like that. Okay. Um, cool. Well, thanks again, Nick, and I'll see you next time.
Yep. See you next time. Thank you.